The Renminbi Bridge Mechanism, a Post-Bretton Woods architecture. Section 1. Historical context. The Bretton Woods system emerged in the aftermath of World War II as a coordinated effort to stabilize global trade, rebuild war-torn economies, and prevent the competitive devaluations that had characterized the interwar period. At its core, Bretton Woods established the U.S. dollar as the central settlement currency for international trade, anchored by a formal gold convertibility mechanism. Foreign nations exported goods to the United States, accumulated dollar surpluses, and recycled those surpluses into U.S. treasuries or other dollar-denominated assets. While gold convertibility existed in theory, it was rarely exercised in practice. The dominant incentive for surplus nations was yield and growth, not inert reserves. U.S. treasuries offered safety, liquidity, and income, while access to U.S. capital markets provided long-term growth exposure. This dynamic transformed the dollar from a settlement instrument into the world's primary store of value, embedding U.S. sovereign debt at the center of the global financial system. Over time, however, this structure revealed a fundamental contradiction, later formalized as the Triffin dilemma. To supply the world with reserve assets, the United States had to run persistent trade deficits and expand its balance sheet. What began as a stabilizing feature became a structural burden. Foreign accumulation of U.S. debt constrained domestic policy, required ever larger interest payments, and introduced systemic fragility. The same infrastructure that granted the United States global financial visibility and enforcement power through the dollar and SWIFT also created long-term fiscal and political vulnerabilities. Section 2. The Renminbi Bridge Mechanism, RBM. The Renminbi Bridge Mechanism represents a deliberate departure from this reserve-centric architecture. Rather than attempting to elevate the renminbi into a global store of value, China has positioned it as a bridging currency, a transactional rail through which trade is settled, surpluses circulate, and industrial demand is recycled. In this framework, the renminbi functions as a medium of exchange and coordination instrument, not as a terminal savings asset. A defining feature of the RBM is the separation of monetary roles. Settlement and circulation are handled by the renminbi, while long-term value storage is implicitly delegated to gold. China has expanded gold settlement infrastructure and pricing venues not to peg its currency, but to provide an off-ramp for surplus holders who prefer asset finality over reinvestment. This preserves confidence without encouraging hoarding of renminbi itself. Under RBM, China imports commodities and intermediate goods from a broad network of trading partners, settling transactions in renminbi. Those partners, in turn, are incentivized to recycle accumulated balances into Chinese goods, infrastructure, technology, and services. The terminal sink for foreign surpluses is not Chinese sovereign debt, but Chinese industrial output. This creates a closed-loop system in which settlement, production, and reinvestment reinforce one another without requiring China to absorb global savings onto its balance sheet. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 3. Incentive Structure. China's incentives under the Renminbi Bridge Mechanism are primarily structural rather than symbolic. By encouraging renminbi-based trade settlement, China gains visibility into transaction flows, supply chain dependencies, and trade volumes, an informational advantage historically associated with reserve currencies. However, because the renminbi is not positioned as a store of value, this visibility does not require opening sovereign debt markets to foreign accumulation or paying long-term yield premiums. For trading partners, RBM offers multiple pathways. Renminbi balances can be spent directly on Chinese goods and services, invested in infrastructure projects, or converted into gold if final settlement is preferred. This flexibility lowers resistance to participation while reducing reliance on the dollar-based system. Importantly, the design discourages passive reserve accumulation and instead promotes active circulation. This incentive alignment allows China to sidestep the Triffin dilemma entirely. Because the renminbi is not required to function as the world's savings asset, China is not compelled to run structural deficits or expand sovereign liabilities to satisfy external demand. Trade flows can grow without transforming into balance sheet obligations, preserving monetary sovereignty while sustaining industrial demand. Section 4. Implications and strategic consequences. The Renminbi Bridge Mechanism signals a broader shift in global monetary architecture, from balance sheet power to flow-based power. Where Bretton Woods concentrated influence through debt issuance and reserve accumulation, RBM concentrates influence through settlement, circulation, and informational access. Control is exercised not by absorbing global savings, but by routing global trade. This architecture limits the need for overt financial weaponization while retaining strategic awareness. China gains insight into trade networks without inheriting the political and fiscal liabilities that accompany reserve currency dominance. Over time, this may encourage a more multipolar monetary environment in which reserve assets, settlement rails, and production centers are no longer unified under a single sovereign issuer. In this sense, the Renminbi Bridge Mechanism is not a rival to Bretton Woods, but its evolutionary successor, a system designed for a world where monetary coordination is achieved through infrastructure and flow management rather than reserve accumulation and debt expansion.